of these steps, we tried to carry this message to alcoholics and to practice these principles in all our affairs. Now, I've had a couple of people that I've consulted. I go over the steps with other people who are, I don't know, people who are trying to figure it out. That's all. I don't want to say intellectuals, but I want to say people who are trying to figure out what the hell was going on here. How do I implement these steps into my life? And if you'll read into the step 12, one of the guys that I've come across that I talk to says, if you'll read this step, it says that you don't start helping people through the 12 steps until you've had this spiritual awakening. And it does say, having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps, we tried to carry this message to alcoholics and practice these principles in all our affairs. And my argument was that you're supposing here that you've now had a measurable spiritual awakening, that you can actually say that there was a time and a day that I can say that I actually transformed. My life went from the old life to the new life, and I now have a spiritual awakening as a result. There was a day that I could measure and say that was the day that I had a spiritual awakening. And that at that point, I was capable of taking others through the 12 steps, because at that point, I could explain to them how to have a spiritual awakening as they would understand, coming to their God. But my argument on the side is that, number one, let's look at the history of AA. And that was that Ebby Thatcher was, if you go back to Bill's story, Ebby Thatcher was one of Bill Wilson's childhood friends, as he puts it. Boyhood friends, I think, childhood, something like that. But Ebby Thatcher had come from the Oxford groups, instructed by them to help other people. And Ebby said, I know just the guy to go help. I'm going to go see Bill. So he goes over and he sees Bill Wilson, and he explains the steps to Bill. And Bill gets sober and never has another drink as long as he lives. But Ebby Thatcher goes out and drinks. You see what I'm saying? Is that the idea that you have to wait to have a spiritual awakening in order to help other people have a spiritual awakening is not true. Because whether or not someone's going to have a spiritual awakening isn't really contingent on whether I've had one or not. And it can easily be seen in that story of Bill and Ebby. That Ebby then came back and Bill sponsored him and Ebby never drank again. So sponsor becomes sponsee in a story like that. So when you're reading this, you're saying that, so having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps, that is when we try to carry the message to alcoholics and to practice these steps in all of our affairs. And my argument, like I said, was that at no point can I look back on my sobriety and say there was a specific day that I believe that I had a spiritual awakening. It's somewhat been a gradual awakening, and it's been more and more as the years go on. And there was no point in the last 20 years that I've been sober have I actually said, that was the day. I can tell you the day I stopped drinking was August 17th, 1990, because it's on my arrest sheet where I had to get it out to go get my expungement and all that stuff. And I had to, there's my sobriety date. And, that's the last day I got arrested. So that was not the day that I had a spiritual awakening. It was a gradually, like they said, it was a mustard seed. And the mustard seed becomes this huge tree later on. It's almost something you can't even see. And there was no point in which I could actually say that I could measure it and say that was the day that. So here's the dilemma: is everybody's saying, well, I shouldn't really be helping other people through the 12 steps because I really don't feel like I've had a spiritual awakening. Therefore, I can't. If I haven't had this experience, how am I going to help somebody else have one? I can't explain something to them that I don't even know if I've had myself. But that puts you in a dilemma of you can't stay sober unless you help other people. And now you're saying you can't help other people because you're not sober. You haven't had this spiritual awakening, sort of a catch-22 in which you can't do this until you do that, and you can't do that until you do this. So that's my opinion on that: is start helping other people right out of the gate, as soon as you can. If you got 3 steps and you understand the first 3 steps, you can help somebody get along that far. If you're out on step 6 or 8 or 9 or whatever it is you feel you're at, then that's how far that you think that you can help other people get to. And the idea of the spiritual awakening that they're talking of, what is the nature of this spiritual awakening can easily be seen by simply going back over the steps and saying, well, first of all, like in step 1, I am not God. It says, first of all, we had to quit playing God. And this is in the 3rd step, like in the next page we get over here. First of all, this is the how and why of it. First of all, we had to quit playing God. And that's the idea behind step 1, is complete ego deflation. And upon a completely devastated person, a completely deflated ego, we can build a new person, someone who's willing to completely invert their way of life, in which they were once a selfish, self-centered person who thought little of others and can now be a giving and caring person and live a life of sacrifice for others, in which I completely, one description says, a set of principles that once the guiding forces of someone's life, I've now been completely cast aside for a whole new set of principles and guiding forces to guide them in their life. And that is, the idea of selfishness. So when we're reading these third step pages here, we're going to be looking for selfishness and self-centeredness as being the root cause of our alcoholism, and the exact opposite of that, service and self-sacrifice for others as being the spiritual solution. And that's why back in Bill's story where he said, I ruthlessly face my sins, we don't deal with sin in AA. And nowhere in this book will you see anything like, some of the stuff you see in the 12 and 12, like the 12 horsemen of the bewilderment and fear and whatever that is, and they got the 11-step prayers of St. Francis of Assisi guy. There's a lot of religious stuff in the 12 and 12, and I don't want to badmouth it, but to say that it was almost co-written by Bill's sponsor, who was a Jesuit priest. It was Father Ed Dowling of the Jesuit ministry or something like that. Anyway, back to where we're at here. Many of us exclaimed, okay, the idea that we tried to carry this message to alcoholics, that's the message that we carry, and the way I've learned it over the years is, when I first started sponsoring people and people would call me and say, oh, I got this problem, what do I do about it? I couldn't wait to tell them what to do about their problem. And I was learning, we're all in a learning process, and I would proceed to tell them what they should do about this particular problem in their life. And I knew that deep down inside, I knew that it wasn't right. I had this gut feeling that, look, I couldn't even manage my own life just a few short years ago. There was nothing left of me, and who the hell am I to give another person advice on their life? To be honest with you, I am completely reliant and dependent upon a power greater than myself for all things. I've turned in everything. I am still powerless over everything, and my life is still unmanageable because now I let God manage everything. I got the little things I got to do, like get up in the morning and quit hitting the snooze and do what I have to do on a daily basis. But anyway, this is the message that I try to practice and to try to carry to alcoholics. And the practice, what we practice in all of our affairs, when we get out there in step 4 through 9, we're going to see that there are basically 3 primary spiritual solutions that we're going to be practicing in all of our affairs. And they are forgiveness, making amends, and faith in God. Those 3 spiritual solutions are the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. And those are the things that I'm supposed to be practicing in all my affairs. And one of the things I heard a guy say this in a meeting years back, and I'm going to say the same thing because when I heard him say it, I said, you know what, that's really accurate. And what I'm going to say is we all know that they have those principles behind the steps: brotherly love, honesty, open-mindedness, willingness, whatever those principles behind the steps are, that is not Alcoholics Anonymous. And why we got to throw that stuff in the trash and get it out of AA is because what it's doing is it's taking away from the original message of the steps, and it's putting people on this path toward brotherly love. Oh, I don't have to make amends. All I have to do is have brotherly love. Or if you go to another step and say that one of those steps is honesty, oh, I don't have to do that real step. All I have to do is practice honesty and stop lying to everybody. Or any one of those steps that you come to and see where they write some kind of principle that's behind it, to where you can say, oh, now I can safely ignore the actual work outlined in that step and focus primarily on this principle that they say lies behind the step. And what I'm trying to say is that's doing more damage to Alcoholics Anonymous than it is good. Because I was looking for an easier, softer way. When I first started sponsoring people, I said, you know what? I don't want to sponsor people. That's hard work. Who wants to, somebody says, will you help me through the steps? And you go, oh, God. You know what? No. This weekend I had something planned. I was going fishing, and then we're doing this, and we're going to have dinner, and we're going to see a movie. And, that's the first thing that comes to my mind is, if there's an easier, softer way out of the hard work of these 12 steps, I would probably have taken that. But fortunately, I had a sponsor who was sponsoring people, who was assigning sponsees to other people. As he knew that someone was capable of sponsoring someone, he would grab one of the guys who goes, will you help me, and pair him off with one of the guys he was sponsoring. So, well, now, you don't see a lot of that kind of activity in AA today. It's sort of akin to early Alcoholics Anonymous. There's a story in AA Comes of Age about the Cleveland group. And the third group was Cleveland. Akron was number 1, New York was number 2, and Cleveland was number 3. And the number 3 group was largely responsible for the spread of Alcoholics Anonymous. They had 10 times the success rate that Akron had. They had 10 times the success rate that the New York group had. And they told you that they admitted flat out largely that Cleveland was responsible for the spread of Alcoholics Anonymous. And he goes on to say why. Because they were so overwhelmed, and Cleveland was such a big town at the time, and so many people coming in. You know, Akron was a small town, and where New York was, it wasn't a small town, but they weren't exactly overwhelmed like Cleveland was. I guess maybe there was more alcoholics in Cleveland or whatever, I don't know. But what he writes is that the Cleveland group was so overwhelmed that they were actually getting to the point that they would assign sponsors. As they would come in the door, they'd go, "Oh, you're a new guy? Well, this one's got 2 weeks. He can help you." And then as that guy would get 2 weeks, the next guy in the door would go, "Oh, you're a new guy? Well, this guy's got 2 weeks. He can help you." Because the people who had 2 or 3 years at the time, which was the old-timers, had 15, 20, 30 guys they were working with, and they were just overwhelmed, and they couldn't do it. So they had this method of bringing the new people coming in through the door and lining them up and saying, "Okay, you guys with these guys." And that's why they had such a large success rate. That the more people actually worked with others to try to help them get sober, the more people were staying sober. And that's one of the basic ideas that I had heard anyway. Let's start reading a little bit. I'm gabbing too much. Many of us exclaimed, "What an order." Now remember, when we see this we and many of us, who is many of us is the people who wrote the book. The first 100 alcoholics who wrote the book. Everything you read in here is in the context of what these people had essentially conveyed to Bill Wilson. As Bill Wilson was, he wrote the book, but he was in touch with the other people at the first 100 alcoholics who were sober at the time. And when he wrote the chapter to wives, Bill Wilson wasn't a wife, obviously, but he was in contact with some of the women who were wives of husbands who were drinking and took in some input from them. But when you read the chapter to wives, it looks like it's written by wives. It even says, "We wives of alcoholics," and it looks like it was written by a wife, but it was Bill Wilson. But anyway, many of us exclaimed, "What an order, I can't go through with it." Do not be discouraged. No one among us has been able to maintain anything like perfect adherence to these principles. We are not saints. The point is that we are willing to grow along spiritual lines. The principles we have set down are guides to progress. We claim spiritual progress rather than spiritual perfection. Our description of the alcoholic, which would be more about alcoholism, the chapter to the agnostic, and our personal adventures before and after. And that's a reference to the stories out there in the back of the book. There's 41 personal stories back there. Make clear 3 pertinent ideas. A, that we were alcoholic and could not manage our own lives. B, that probably no human power could have relieved our alcoholism. And C, that God could and would if he were sought. Being convinced we were at step 3, which is that we decided to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood him. Just what do we mean by that, and just what do we do? ? He's fixing to tell us. What do we mean by making a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood him? The first requirement is that we be convinced that any life run on self-will can hardly be a success. So we have a requirement here of the third step, and the first one is that we be convinced that any life run on self-will can hardly be a success. So here we're getting the idea of self-will and God's will. In step 11, we look back where it says we pray only for the knowledge of God's will for us and the power to carry that out. And we're getting these 2 ideas here, the opposite ends of the spectrum. The alcoholism is rooted in and driven by self-will, and the spiritual solution to this is the exact opposite of it, which is God's will. On that basis, we are almost always in collision with something or somebody, even though our motives are good. I could give you an example of that. I know there's a guy that comes to the AA meetings that I go to, and I genuinely feel that this person wants to help people. But some of the things that he says and some of the things that he does in AA meetings are absolutely poisonous and toxic. And when I look around the room when this person shares, it's always like, God, will somebody please explain to him the 12 steps before he just beats us all to death with these lashings, verbal, poisonous, toxic lashings of untreated alcoholism coming from him. And And I know that his motives are good. I have no doubt about that this man wants to help other people, but he doesn't know. He doesn't. And, it's a little easier for me to say, I can forgive him for that, but my God, somebody's got to help him. So even though his motives are good, he's in collision with something or somebody. Most people try to live by self-propulsion. And, in my opinion, it's my experience with this, is that when we get to the fourth step, we're going to make some of you may be familiar with the 3 columns of the fourth step. And the third column being, what part of your life does it affect? Your self-esteem, your personal relations, your ambition, your pride. What part of your life does this affect? And for years, I didn't understand what that was about. I used to say, I'd breeze right through it and go, okay, I'll write it down and blah, blah. And even when I taught people for a while there, I didn't know exactly what it was. But when I came across a guy who could explain it to me, he said, what you're doing here is you're going to get an understanding that nobody made a conscious decision to be a selfish, self-centered person. Nobody sat down at a table one day, scratching on their head and contemplating and saying, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to be a selfish and self-centered person, and I'm going to think only of myself and have little concern for other people except for when it had something to benefit from me. Nobody does that. What I'm doing when I'm an alcoholic and I'm in my alcoholism is I'm running on self-will, and it's sort of like a natural instinct for self-preservation. The fear that I'm not going to get what I want out of life, or the fear that I'm going to lose the things that I have, are literally running my life, okay? And when I do things that hurt other people, it's only because I'm afraid for myself. I'm afraid that I don't trust God to take care of everything. I don't trust God to take care of me and all of my fears, okay? And I'm hurting the people in my life, not intentionally either. I never intended to hurt my family, but I lied to them and I stole from them. And I tell you, I will never do that again, because I understand today why I was doing that. I wasn't doing it because I didn't care about them. I did it because I was afraid for myself. And that's what that's all about. Even though my motives were good, most people try to live by self-propulsion. And this is an analogy. Bill gives several analogies in here. One of the analogies he gives is like how one alcoholic can help another, and why is one alcoholic comfortable helping another and one alcoholic comfortable being helped by another alcoholic. Whereas if a psychiatrist who was not an alcoholic was trying to help us, we'd be like, you don't understand. Shut up. You got nothing to say to me. You're not an alcoholic. So when one alcoholic can help another alcoholic, he gives us an analogy of the people who are in a shipwreck, and we feel a certain camaraderie, that we've all been through the same common peril, that we can feel connected to one another. And there's another analogy of the guy who's a jaywalker, who skips out in front of a bus and it gives him a rush and he gets high off of it. So he's skipping out in front of all these cars until one day he gets messed up by one real bad. And this is an analogy of a guy who is an actor in a show whose ego is so big that he's trying to tell a director how to run the place. He's trying to tell him where to put the lights, how to move everything. Instead of just being an actor and playing his part, he wants to run the whole damn. And that's what he's saying that alcoholics are like. Each person is like an actor who wants to run the whole show, is forever trying to arrange the lights, the ballet, the scenery, and the rest of the players in his own way. If his arrangements would only stay put, if only people would do as he wished, the show would be great. Everybody, including himself, would be pleased. Life would be wonderful. In trying to make these arrangements, our actor might sometimes be quite virtuous. He may be kind, considerate, patient, generous, even modest and self-sacrificing. On the other hand, he may be mean, egotistical, which is probably more likely in my case. He may be mean, egotistical, selfish, and dishonest. And you see what he's saying here? These are some of the core of our inventory. The idea that he may be mean, egotistical, selfish, dishonest, these are all core parts of our inventory when we get out to it. Mean being more like, angry. I guess that would be another way of describing it. But as with most humans, he is more likely to have varied traits. What usually happens, the show doesn't come off very well. He begins to think life doesn't treat him very well, doesn't treat him right. He decides to exert himself more. He becomes, on the next occasion, still more demanding or gracious, as the case may be. Still, the play does not suit him. Admitting he may be somewhat at fault, he is sure that other people are more to blame. He becomes angry, indignant, self-pitying. What is the basic trouble? Is he not really a self-seeker, even when trying to be kind? Is he not a victim of the delusion that he can wrest satisfaction and happiness out of this world, if only he manages well? Is it not evident to all the rest of the players that these are the things that he wants? And do not his actions make each one of them wish to retaliate, snatching all they can get out of the show? Now, the idea that these other actors want to retaliate against him is one of the things that we see when we get our resentment list. Is one of the ways that helps us free ourselves of resentment is to see that a lot of the people who have made us angry over the years were simply retaliating against us for something that we had done in the past. Not in every case, but in many of them. What we're simply experiencing is someone else getting angry because we're doing something that affects them. Is he not, even in the best moments, a producer of confusion rather than harmony? Our actor is self-centered or egocentric, as people like to call it nowadays. He is like the retired businessman who lolls in the Florida sunshine in the winter, complaining of the sad state of the nation. The minister who sighs over the sins of the 20th century. Politicians and reformers who are sure all would be utopia if the rest of the world would only behave. The outlaw safecracker who thinks society has wronged him. And you know, I heard he got that story from one of the early people that he was working with was a safecracker. It's in Comes of Age, and he actually sponsored a guy who was a safecracker and gave him some of these ideas here. And the alcoholic who has lost all and is locked up. Whatever our protestations are, not most of us concerned with ourselves, our resentments, or our self-pity. This is a real profound statement here. He's going to tell us that this is the root of our troubles. And that this, remember back in the chapter, There is a Solution, he writes, what we have in Alcoholics Anonymous, we have a common solution. A solution upon which we can all agree upon. That this is the same problem that all alcoholics are experiencing. And that just because someone is a man or a woman or whatever background you may have, a lawyer, a doctor, a carpenter, a janitor, whatever it is, we all have the same solution that we can absolutely agree upon. So whenever I read in the chapter how it works, he says, those who do not recover are people who cannot or will not completely give themselves to this simple program, and usually those who are constitutionally incapable of being honest with themselves. So, from my experience with it, people who do not recover from alcoholism are a brand of people who see this selfishness and self-centeredness that we think is the root of our troubles, driven by 100 forms of fear. Don't look at it in the same light that I do. When I look at it, I go, yes, I admit it. I am a selfish, self-centered person, and everything that I have done in the past has been driven by the fear that I am afraid, essentially. I don't trust in God. But apparently some people see this, that the people that are constitutionally incapable of being honest with themselves, they're talking about self-honesty, not constitutionally incapable of being honest because somebody gave them $5 too much at the Publix up here or something, and change or something. This is about self-honesty. And when I'm working my way through these steps, I look at them and I said to myself, yes, that's me. Boy, you guys had my number. They know exactly why I'm doing what I'm doing. But other people don't do that. Other people, I've actually had sponsees who've come back to me and said, I really don't have anybody that I'm angry at. I'm feeling fine. There's nothing that I'm afraid of. And all I can think of is, well, when you feel like working AA, give me a call, Because I do the same thing my sponsors did with me, and they said, don't sit down and write down what it is that you're angry about, the people that have made you. Just start writing people's names down first. Write everybody's names down, your mom, dad, sister, brother, and then write down something that they had done in the past that's pissed you off. And go from it from that standpoint, But anyway, so this statement, selfishness and self-centeredness, that we think is the root of our troubles, driven by 100 forms of fear. And where we're going with a lot of this is we're going to find a solution to this. We're going to find a solution to selfishness and self-centeredness. And the solution, we believe, is, as Bill put it in his story, that a life of service, a work and self-sacrifice for others is the spiritual solution to selfishness and self-centeredness. That it is just that easy, that that when I think of other people and do things for other people and have a genuine concern for other people, and which is something that will develop over the period of, maybe years or something. I genuinely have grown from at first I had to force myself to do things for other people because I was explained to me that it was in my best interest. And then later on I began to get the results of this, and I began to say, you know what, I want to do things for other people because I now know that there's a good result of it. I start to feel better about who I am. And when I'm feeling better about who I am, somebody goes, hey, buddy, you want a nice cold beer? I go, no, I don't need a nice cold beer right now. I have a perfectly good defense against that first ice cold beer. I feel pretty good about who I am as a person. But anyway, we'll pick up right there next week. It's selfishness and self-centeredness. I don't want to talk all day. Things like, rarely have we seen a person fail who has thoroughly followed our path. And we stood at the turning point. We asked his protection and care with complete abandon, not partial abandon, not lackadaisically. We didn't say, hey, God, get me out of this one. We asked his protection and care with complete abandon. And what I'm going to do is we're going to finish up the third step today, but we're going to keep referring back to the third step, too, repeatedly, all throughout the rest of them, as we try to see how each one of these steps, as I learned it, they're all dependent upon one another. You can't get sober without one of the steps. I hear people come in here, and there's a guy in here the other day said, I got step 1 down, I got 20 years. I got step 1, step 3, and step 11, or step 12, and forget about all the others. And I'm thinking, oh, what a nightmare that must be. You can't. They don't stand alone. None of the steps stands alone. Let me put it to you this way: if you're putting a transmission in a car, and step 1 is to lift the car up, step 2 is to start taking the bolts out of the transmission, step 3 is to lower the transmission, take the fluid out, lower the If you leave any of those steps out, guess what? You probably, when you get to start it up and put it in gear, it ain't going nowhere. Okay. Any one of the steps, if you leave some bolts out, if you stop and don't put the fluid back in it, I put it all back together, got in there, didn't put any fluid in it, it wouldn't go nowhere. Same thing with the steps. Each one of them is vital to get to where you're going. And what he said, what the guy I learned, my teacher said, was each one builds upon the step that comes after it, and each step is dependent upon the one that goes before it. So in other words, you can't do step 3 if you haven't done step 2. But there is the idea that all you need to do is become willing to believe in a power greater than yourself. But still, that's a pretty big step for somebody who says there is no God, which is what that's pretty much directed at. Because if you've answered the question, yes, you believe in God, then you just move right on through to step 3. But anyway, here we are at step 3, and we're going to read about 2/3 of the way down the page. And if we're lucky, we'll get through the next page or so and into the 4th step, which is on the next page, 64. And I'll tell you, one of the things, we're going to back up and read the 3rd step prayer again. I'll tell you what, just a couple of lines. You see where it says, we found it desirable to take this spiritual step with an understanding person. Of course, they didn't have sponsors back in the day. They just, whoever, it even says, we found it desirable to take this spiritual step with an understanding person, such as our wife, best friend, or spiritual advisor. Now, where's sponsor? Why isn't sponsor in there? Because this book is your sponsor. In 1939, this book was written to explain the 12 steps to you. And let me take you out to the vision for you just for a minute. And we're going to keep coming out here, too, because it's good to understand what it is that we're trying to read here from the standpoint of the context of what they wrote it in. They wrote it in the context that you were going to be in a city 500 miles from Akron or New York, and you didn't have any access to Alcoholics Anonymous. Maybe you were in a drunk tank or something. And when they wrote this, they wrote it for people to be your sponsor. And no one should ever teach don't get a sponsor, but that's the context this book was written. And you can easily see, you should have somebody who understands it a little more, because it took me years to start to comprehend some of this stuff. But let me take you out to page 163, or 162 at the bottom. On page 162 at the bottom, he says, thus we grow, and so can you. Though you be but one man with this book in your hand, we believe and hope it contains all you will need to begin. We know what you're thinking. You are saying to yourself, I am jittery and alone. I could not do that, but you can. You forget that you have just now tapped a source of power much greater than yourself. To duplicate with such backing what we have accomplished is only a matter of willingness, patience, and labor. So you see where he says, though you be but one man with this book in your hand, I'm jittery and alone. The idea that this book was written to take you through the steps and to help you understand the steps. It's important to see that because we all refer to it as our basic text, and it even refers to it as the basic text in the 12 and 12 and many of the other places that I've seen it written about. But anyway, back to page 63. That's why he tells us, we found it desirable to take this spiritual step with an understanding person such as our wife, best friend, or spiritual advisor. But it is better to meet God alone than with one who might misunderstand. The wording was, of course, quite optional so long as we expressed the idea. And here's a powerful statement, voicing it without reservation. Now, he says voicing it without reservation. Let's go back to Bill's story on page 13 and see how Bill put it. Bill put it very intense. I would have to say if you were going to write it about as intense as you could, he got it there. And Bill was pretty good at putting what he was thinking on paper and pretty good at explaining himself. But I know there's a lot of people that I've come across that can really complicate things. But Bill's is pretty self-explanatory. He says, so he's laying in the hospital bed here, and Ebby Thatcher had come to visit him again. And he says on page 13, about 8 lines down, this is Bill's third step. There I humbly offered myself to God, as I then understood him, to do with me as he would. I placed myself unreservedly under his care and direction. I admitted for the first time that of myself I was nothing, that without him I was lost. So that's Bill's third step right there. There's another place on page 25. Go to page 25 real quick. This one you're all probably familiar with too. Now, remember, we're making a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood him. Just what do we say, and just what do we do, and what do we mean by that? And he says here, at the bottom of the page on 25, if you are as seriously alcoholic as we were, we believe that there is no middle-of-the-road solution. In other words, you can't make a half measures availed us nothing is primarily pertaining to this third step, the turning of your life over to the care of God. And there is no middle of the road, so there's no middle of the road in here. It's one or the other. You can't say, well, I'm going to I'll do a little bit of it and let's see how it turns out. It ain't going to work. Half measures won't avail you half sobriety. Half measures will avail you nothing. There is no middle of the road solution. We were in a position where life was becoming impossible. And if we had passed into the region from which there is no return through human aid, we had but 2 alternatives. Now, this is the decision that you have to make, the decision to turn your life, your will and your life over to the care of God, or go back to the nightmare of that drinking that you've been experiencing. We had but 2 alternatives. One was to go on to the bitter end, blotting out the consciousness of our intolerable situation as best we could. The other, to accept spiritual help. And that's a reference to step 3, that there's only 2 decisions here. There is no third decision. And one more on page 48. Go to page 48. And this is in We Agnostics, I believe. 48, he says, now this is about, there's no real spot to say, but it's about 10 or 12 lines down where he says, faced with alcoholic destruction. And now this is, remember, what is the motivating factor for me to turn my will and my life over to the care of God? This is you got 2 decisions. There's only 2 alternatives, and this is one of the others here. Faced with alcoholic destruction, we soon became as open-minded on spiritual matters as we had tried to be on other questions. In this respect, alcohol was a great persuader. It finally beat us into a state of reasonableness. Sometimes this was a tedious process. We hope no one else will be prejudiced for as long as we were. So alcohol is the great persuader that puts us into this position to completely surrender. And back on page 63, if you'll read in where the third step prayer is again, you see where he says at the end of that third step prayer, may I do thy will always. This is in the middle of the page on 63. He says, we thought well before taking this step, making sure we were ready, that we could at last abandon ourselves utterly to him. Now, it sounds pretty intense, and I got to tell you, it for me, it scared the hell out of me, but so too did going back to that nightmare. I'll be honest with you, for me, there was only 2 alternatives. It was get sober or die. There was no go back to the drinking for me. So for me, it was a pretty easy decision. It was like how he said alcohol had beat us into a state of reasonableness, and that, I would have to say, comes from my own experience, from years of trying to go back to normal drinking. And when you're finally done with it and when you finally come in, this is what you have to turn your will and your life. You have to completely surrender your life to God, abandon yourself utterly to Him, voicing it without reservation. And this was only a beginning, though if honestly and humbly made, an effect, sometimes a very great one, was felt at once. And I have to say that was my experience, was when I had made that decision. And remember what he says on the next page, that although you have now made this decision to surrender, you're going to abandon yourself utterly to God, and you're voicing it without reservation. And though this was only a beginning, though if honestly and humbly made, an effect, sometimes a very great one, was felt at once, it won't keep you sober. You must go on, and that's where he says this is not the beginning of the fourth step, but there's a sort of a transitional paragraph here between 3 and 4, where he says, next we launched out on a course of vigorous action, the first step of which is a personal house cleaning. So you can see where he actually says that this is the first step of vigorous action, where the first 3 steps, 1, 2, and 3, are really a result of the drinking that we've done. That, like he says over here on page 62, this is the how and why of it. First of all, we had to quit playing God. It didn't work. Next, we decided that hereafter in this drama of life, God was going to be our director. He is the principal, and we are his agents. Now, where does this third step set in the 12 steps is, if you're going to become completely reliant and dependent upon God for all things, you have to first make a decision to turn your life over to this God. And what you're making a decision to do, you may not know it yet, but looking out ahead of you, what you're making a decision to do is come back to these rooms and help other people through the 12 steps. That what we believe that God wants us to do is to live a life of service and self-sacrifice, or work and self-sacrifice for others. That's back in Bill's story. So this is the decision that you're making to do. You are making a decision to come back to AA and help others through the 12 steps. Because what the psychiatrist wrote about, I think it was Harry Tiebout had written, and he wrote this in a letter to the American Psychiatric Association back in like 1950, I think it was, or something. Maybe a little earlier than that. But he had written that he was going to he was like what'd they call him? An honorary member of Alcoholics Anonymous. He wasn't an alcoholic, but he would sit in the meetings and they would allow him, and he would jot down things and go, and wonder how these alcoholics are getting each other sober, and the psychiatrists have failed for so long to do anything with them. Remember what the psychiatrist said, that I hoped you weren't that hopeless variety that we're dealing with, because they're so sad that there's nothing we can do for you. Once in a while, they've had a success with a spiritual awakening, but that was very rare, a lot more rare than it is today. So on page 64, to continue, personal house cleaning, which many of us had never attempted. Though our decision was a vital and crucial step, that decision of the third step is vital and crucial. It could have little permanent effect unless at once followed by a strenuous effort to face and to be rid of the things in ourselves which had been blocking us. Our liquor was but a symptom, so we had to get down to causes and conditions. Now, there's a lot said in that little transitional paragraph there. That's the paragraph between step 3 and step 4, where you can see in this next line where he says, therefore we started upon a personal inventory, and this was step 4. So, having said that, you can easily see that the fourth step is a strenuous effort. Actually, I would lump all 6 of those steps together. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9 are the process of finding what blocks you from God and applying the spiritual solution to be free of those things. Remember, we've been going over the spiritual solutions. We'll get into details of those spiritual solutions as we work our way through these pages. But spiritual solutions involve ourselves, another human, and a higher power. Another human being. Like he says in step 5, he says we admitted to ourselves, to another human being, and to God the exact nature of our wrongs. That's the same aspect of forgiveness, faith in God, making amends, and the spiritual solution of the admission of step 5. All 4 of those are the spiritual solutions of Alcoholics Anonymous. And whenever I see practice these principles in all our affairs, that's what I see. Because essentially what he's saying is practice these steps in all of our affairs. Practice the 12 steps, and the meat and the potatoes of the 12 steps is the spirit, the inventory process coupled with the spiritual solutions. And one of our last spiritual solutions that we get to is step 12. Step 12 is faith in God. That's the result of step 12. Okay, so let's see. Our liquor was but a symptom, so we had to get down to the causes and conditions. That any attempt to shield the alcoholic from temptation is doomed to failure. That's out in working with others. And back in the doctor's opinion, anything, what's he say? Not scheme. He says scheme out in the other one. Any plan. Hell, I forgot how it goes now. Any plan to stop from drinking along these lines must have depth and weight. Any idea to stop these hell, I got it underlined back here. It's better if I put it out there the way the doctor put it out there. Must have depth and weight. I'll be a little more prepared next time. I don't want to take too much time on that. Any plan to stop us from drinking must have depth and weight. Here it is. This is XXVI, but I got an older book. It might be a different page in you guys' books. This one says, I'll just read it real quick. The doctor's opinion. Frothy emotional appeal seldom suffices. The message which can interest and hold these alcoholics must have depth and weight. In nearly all cases, their ideals must be grounded in a power greater than themselves if they are to recreate their lives. So that's doctor's opinion in 616 XXVI. But anyway, so we're getting into the 4th step here now. Now, one of the reasons I spend so much time on these pages, and we zoom right across some of the other pages back in We Agnostics, and there is a solution. But right here are some of the most important pages of the recovery program. And when we start the 4th step, remember that we're going to keep reflecting back on, we made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God. Now what we're going to do is we're going to find what's been keeping us from doing that. How come I can't say that I was turning my will and my life over to the care of God before this point? Okay, this is what's blocking us from step 12, essentially. You say to yourself, well, I'm making a list here of what blocks me from God, and then I'm going to apply the spiritual solution to be free of these things. What is it that they're blocking? How is it that they're blocking me from God? Because they're blocking me from thinking of other people before I think of myself. They're blocking me from helping others through the 12th step. And back to what I was saying about the psychiatrist, we're bringing up about what he had written down, and I believe it's very helpful to have another person's point of view, maybe even say an outsider's point of view of what's going on in AA. And remember that William Silkworth was, from what I understand, a psychiatrist. He was the head psychiatrist of a nationally known hospital for the treatment of alcoholics. That's how Bill puts it back in the doctor's opinion. But this other guy was in New York, and some other, I forget the other. There's 2 or 3 of them in New York where he had catered to alcoholics. When he got back to New York, he first went to these places to go out and seek them out. He didn't just go to the park bench and pull. He went to the drunk tanks because Bill favors treatment. Hospitalization is a favored approach for approaching these people. You got to get their minds defogged, or as he put it, cleared up a little bit, But anyway, the psychiatrist had said that what these 12 steps seem to be doing for these alcoholics is they get this initial dose of ego deflation from alcohol, and it smashes them, and they can stay sober for a brief period of time. On the how's it say, the alcohol was the great persuader that beat us into a state of reasonableness. And what we get from these 12 steps is what he called a continued source of ego deflation. So what we're looking at here is we're looking to find. Remember, one of the things that I forget where I had seen that, but ego and self can almost be seen in the same light. that an egotistical person can also be seen as a person who is full of themselves, thinking themselves as omnipotent or godlike in this world. And this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to find what almost the core of our ego, our anger, our fear, our guilt, and we're going to try to be free of these things through these spiritual solutions. And each one of these spiritual solutions requires action and turning to God for help. Okay. This is the beginning of the fourth step. A few more minutes here. Therefore, we started upon a personal inventory. Now, this is an analogy. Bill gives several analogies. Remember the analogy of the guy the shipwreck. We are like people who have experienced the same shipwreck. We feel a certain camaraderie, a certain connection to one another. And that's the analogy he gives to why one alcoholic can help another alcoholic. Then he gives the analogy of the jaywalker who skips out in front of a fast-moving trolley and he gets an adrenaline rush. So he keeps jumping out in front of vehicles to get that rush, that high, and then one time one of them runs him over and kills him, breaks his back or whatever it is. So this is the analogy he makes here of a guy who owns a business. And if your business is going to be successful, you must take an inventory of what's in there. Otherwise, it's not going to make it. And the same thing with our lives. We're not going to make it in our lives if we don't take an inventory and find out what's been keeping us from living a life of service to others. Therefore, we started upon this personal inventory. This was step 4. A business which takes no regular inventory usually goes broke. Taking a commercial inventory is a fact-finding and fact-facing process. It is an effort to discover the truth about the stock in trade. One object is to disclose damaged or unsellable goods, to get rid of them promptly and without regret. So that's what we're going to be doing here. We're going to be finding what blocks us from God, and we're going to get rid of them promptly and without regret. If the owner of a business is to be successful, he cannot fool himself about values. Now, I've heard many people, even in the 12 and 12, that says, hey, don't want to be so morbid about this. Let's write down some things that are good about ourselves so we don't shoot ourselves in the head or whatever. But here's the idea, is we're looking to find what is blocking us from God. Are the good things in your life blocking you from God? Do you need to apply spiritual solutions to things that are good about you? But you see, that's one of the things that many people make. They make there's a misconception about the fourth step that what this is a list of how bad of a person I am. You see how bad I am. I'm angry at these people. I've hurt these people. I feel guilty about this. I'm afraid of this. This is how bad of a person I am. But that's not what this is. This is not an indictment of how bad of a person we are. This is a search for what blocks us from God. That's why it's not morbid. It is not morbid to make this list of these things, because we have an honest desire to be free of these things and get them out of our lives. Therefore, this is no morbid search of how bad of a person we are, which is one of the things that they come across. Many of the people who say, don't just write down bad things, write down the good things too. You got to say, why? Why do I need to write down good things? I'm not depressed about this, making a list of all these things that are bad about me, because I'm trying to find what blocks me from God, not make this morbid reflection of how bad of a person I am. You understand? That I just don't see any point in making a list of good things, because so few people actually finish this list of bad things, Why give them more to do? You give them more to do, you give them a bigger mountain to climb over. Most people don't seem to make it through anyway. We did exactly the same thing with our lives. We took stock honestly. First, we searched out the flaws in our makeup which caused the failure to do God's will in the first place, and being convinced that self manifested in various ways was what had defeated us, we considered its common manifestations. So, from this paragraph, we're going to get the words we're going to be using from here on out. Throughout the 12 steps, we're going to be calling these the most common manifestations of self that block us from receiving and doing God's will. You made a decision to turn your will and your life over to the care of God. Now we're going to make a list of the most common manifestations of self, you see, because we believe that God wants us to live a life of sacrifice for others. That essentially, why I was born and why I'm here is to grow into an adult who has genuine concern for other people and does things for the God of my understanding for other people. And what we do in AA is we help other people find their way to this God through these 12 steps. Last week I think I had mentioned that I was going to give you that story about it's pertaining to the third step, and somebody gave me this story. I don't know. I would have to say it was the mid-'90s, mid to late '90s I had heard it. And there stands this question of why am I having so much trouble with self-will? Why am I a selfish, self-centered person? Did I actually go sit down somewhere and make that decision where I contemplated off in some kind of meditation somewhere and said, I wonder, should I live my life as a selfish, self-centered person? Or should I become a sacrificing, self-sacrificing, selfless person who has genuine concern for others and thinks of other people and gives of himself without expectation of anything in reward? Did I do that? Did I sit and contemplate that? I didn't. See, I was a selfish, self-centered person, and I never made a decision to do that. I never made a decision to be I never sat down somewhere and said, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to become an alcoholic. Boy, this is going to be great. Let me tell you about this. No, you see, I was an alcoholic, and I'm a selfish, self-centered person because it is in my instincts. It is instinctually in there that self-preservation is essentially at the root of all of what we're talking about here. When we're talking about our anger, our fear, and the harms that we have done others, it was all based on the instinct that I have for self-preservation. So when we're looking at, when I say to myself, why am I having so much trouble with self-will? I actually had people in my life say, you're a selfish, self-centered SOB and blah, blah. And I thought, whatever. It's usually my parents or a friend or something along those lines that told me I was a selfish person. And I never gave it a second thought. It was just one of the many things that they had said about me, whatever. But the reason today I understand is that somebody explained to me once that self-will is an absolute necessary ingredient for individuality. That without self-will, we would not be individuals. We would be pure instinct alone and nothing else, okay? And self-will makes me Doug and Jim and Tom and Glenn. Glenn, right? I forgot. Sorry. But so it's what makes each one of us an individual, okay? And it would be, your individuality would not be possible without free will, self-will. They're the same thing. Free will and self-will are the same thing. So what's expected of me is that I am supposed to grow from a child to an adult and one day see if I could hold my free will in my hands and say, you know what? I understand that this free will is an absolutely necessary ingredient for my individuality. And it's also the chief stumbling block to serving my primary purpose in this life, of to grow into an adult and living a life of sacrifice for others. And I'm now of my intellect, I grow intellectually and I see it for what it is and I offer it back to God. And I say to God, thank you for my free will, God, okay? And I offer it back to you. You can have it now. What do you want me to do? It's essentially what I'm saying, that I have my free will in my hands and I offer it back to God and say, you can have it. What do you want me to do with my life? And that's when someone painted that picture to me, I said, that makes perfect sense. That what I have to do each day is I have to offer my free will back to God and report for duty and say, what do you want me to do today? Because for me, I was beaten into a state of unreasonableness in which I had two alternatives. One was to die, and the other one was to surrender my life to God. And that's what it took from me. I didn't stop. I don't know about you guys, but I'm not one of those people who stopped one day and said, you know what, I've had enough of this. I stopped one day and said, well, it's dead or stop drinking, one of the two. And that's how far down I had to go. But anyway, we're going to open up the floor for open discussion, and we will pick up next week where he starts resentment is the number one offender. And next week we'll try to get through the whole resentment list and possibly the spiritual solution to resentments, which is forgiveness. And that's a big one too. We may be referring back to the spiritual solutions all throughout the rest of the steps, because even all the way out into step 12 where he says we practice these principles in all our affairs, to me that means I practice forgiveness in all my affairs. I practice making amends in all my affairs. And I practice faith in God and admission of my defects in all my affairs. It doesn't mean I practice brotherly love or open-mindedness. I mean, those things are great, but we're going to keep throwing that on the bus, that the principles behind the steps are not brotherly love, open-mindedness, willingness, and those things are great, but the reason we're not going to stick to those, and the reason we're not going to bring those up and talk about those is because they take away from the original message, okay? And the original message being in step 4 that you make a list of what blocks you from God. And step 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9, you apply the spiritual solutions to be free of that. But we'll start on the resentment list next week, and we're going to open up the floor for anyone who would like to comment on step 3. And whatever you want to comment on it, I'm not going to say, hey, you can't talk about that in here. It's whatever you want to talk about. We got 20 minutes for open discussion. Anybody who would like to, the 3rd step, the 4th step? Really? Hey, Keith.
As far back as I can remember, I've been defiant. My mother used to tell me that constantly as a child. My dishonesty. Speak up a little, please. My dishonesty, my delusional thinking that got warped as my drinking progressed. Caused me, great harm, like you were saying, to my family, my friends, the hostages I took along the way. I've had a hard time coming back this time. I sat out front the first day I got back, and I was so embarrassed, the guilt and the shame. You people pointing fingers, although we're not supposed to take inventory. I got enough people taking my inventory. It don't matter. Well, I really appreciate the knowledge that you have of this program. I need help. I mean, I can't go on. I'm supposed to celebrate this month, and now I'm 7 days back. It's just like I still can't even put the sentences together. I mean, I went out drinking over something. I set myself up for this shit. Going back to the bar, put pieces back together for a relationship, and things didn't go my way. I got a new job, and everything was good, me, skitty bop boo, and then it all doesn't matter. I mean, none of that shit matters. Money is the most easiest thing to gain for me. But there again, it became my God once more. I got a great job, things were going good, years were flowing at the end of the day, and I kept telling them I'm in the program, this and that, until one day, I'll have a Bud Light. That's all it took. They say one is too many and 100's not enough. 3 weeks later, I was in the slammer again. 67 arrests, 63 convictions. Not good odds. I'm not good at drinking. I'm grateful to be here tonight. Thank you.
Thanks for sharing.
Well, step 3 is not that far along. Somebody's got something to say on it, right? Comments or questions?
I'm Gary, I'm an alcoholic.
Hey, Gary.
When I came out here, I was so beat down. I left my mother, my father, my sisters, my brothers, my wives, my daughters, my so-called friends, and everything up north. bus. I was asking this guy who was walking down the street, where was the phone? Because I had to call this guy. That's all I had was his name and phone number on a piece of paper that I had in my hand typed. And strangest thing, this guy had me something that tried to sneak. I was sneaking out of North. North, you know. But anyway, I told him no. Now, for 33 days, I stayed in the detox place. They detoxed me. They didn't open the bed up for me for 3 days out here. And I was in Newark, and I had to pick a place to come to. They said, come to Florida. It's warm. People think, I think, God was testing me because not only did the guy in the first person I got to say something to in Florida came at me wrong. First job I got, there's so many get-overs I could have, took advantage of. Turned it down. One day I was waiting on the bus. Lady left a car sitting on the edge of the parking lot. Walls are way over there, and her car is right there. No top on it. Keys in it. It's running. There's the purses in it. And the bags she was shopping in it. But I didn't take it. I didn't take anything from it. You know. So, I got to that point when I had to make that decision. That's when I found out it was just a decision. All I had to make was that decision. But that was a big decision. That was probably the